Well, ladies and gentlemen, once again you're extremely welcome to the third of our talks on the Reformation. We began, of course, with a kind of background to the meaning of the church, a little bit anyway. Then last time we heard the story of Luther's life, and tonight we come to that man there on the screen, John Calvin. Our speaker tonight is Muriel Wilson. Muriel began her working life as a social worker and then studied theology at New College in Edinburgh. She was a deacon in the Church of Scotland. She worked in parishes in Patna, Waterside and Dunmellion for a while, and is now kind of semi-retired, helping look after her mother, who was 103, was it?
104 in July.
Nobody should have to do that, but that's she, although she's retired, she works part-time as a chaplain in the Ailsa Hospital in there. So I've known Muriel for many, many years. I think it was true to say we're good friends, Muriel.
Yes, we're good friends.
And you're extremely welcome. So we look forward to hearing from you. I had to make sure it was a Presbyterian who was talking about John Calvin. So.
I have to say too, I'm very grateful to Joe because he put this PowerPoint together. So thank you for doing that. That was such a help. Just a general little introduction. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
There are a number of star players in the Reformation. Luther, whom you heard about last month, John Wycliffe, Jan Hus, Zwingli, Thomas Cranmer, and tonight's star, John Calvin. Now each of these great men were shepherds of the Reformation in a specific area of Europe, and each offered his distinct contribution to the Reformation movement at large. John Calvin was the voice of the Reformation in France and Geneva, and he ranks as one of the most prominent and influential thinkers in Protestantism. The influence of his theology and teaching reached across the whole of Europe, and it still influences us today, 5 centuries later. Now, of course, Calvin wasn't the man who launched the Reformation. That was Luther, whom you heard about last month. But all the reformers had one thing in common. They were all convinced that the prevailing 16th century Catholic view of a God who could be influenced by and whose wrath could be bought off by special ways of prayer, by stringent punishing disciplines and monetary payments, was not the God of the Old and the New Testaments. And if you remember the DVD of Luther last month, I think that showed that very clearly. The reformers looked to Scripture and found a God who graciously gave a gift of saving faith. The aphorism, Scripture alone, grace alone, faith alone. That summarizes the basic Reformation message. And Calvin took his place among the second generation of reformers. They were all hammering out their distinctive theologies, often with their own ardent disciples in a particular region and language group. And because of his influential writings in Latin and in French, his systematic pattern of church government, and through the results of the academy that he set up in Geneva, He stands alongside Luther as the most outstanding of the 16th century reformers. Now, before I talk to you about Calvin's life, I'd like to point out to all of you that you will all know something of Calvinist theology, because you're all Ayrshire people. Can you, any of you guess why you might know anything about Calvin's theology? Are any of you Burns fans? Holy Willie's Prayer, the first verse. O thou that in the heavens dost dwell, wha as it pleases best thyself, sends ain to heaven and 10 to hell, all for thy glory, and no for ony good they've done before thee. So that's a good caricature, and there's a lot of truth in it, of Calvin's theology of predestination, or election as he preferred it. So, now I'm going to go through his life with slides of the different cities where he worked and studied. And he really was an exile. He moved around Europe, dotting here and there, staying in places for years, but he was all over the place. He was really an exile, and I think he saw himself as an exile. I think he could identify with the Jewish people who finally got to the Promised Land. He didn't write much about his early years, but in many ways his family situation set the stage for his later life. He was born in Noyon in Picardy, a Catholic cathedral town northeast of Paris. It had been a hub of religious activity for many years. Charlemagne, if you've heard of him, was consecrated there in 768. John, born in 1509, was the second of 7 sons born to Gerard and Jeanne, the daughter of a local innkeeper. And she died when Calvin was very young. Gerard remarried, and 2 daughters were born. Gerard was the son of a boatman, so he had a bit of money, and he used that money to educate his sons. He had a job as a registrar and a notary in the cathedral court. So he arranged grants for his sons. He probably wanted them to be priests, but we don't know that exactly. And Calvin was very precocious. He was probably the brightest of all of the children. And at the age of 12, he was employed by the bishop as a clerk. And he received the tonsure, which meant that he was giving himself to the church. Now, 1523, his first move was to Paris at the age of 14, and he was sent there by his father to study. There are also some scholars that think that he was urged to go there to escape from the plague. But first of all, when he was there, he went to the Collège de la Marche, and then on, the Collège de Montaigu, where Erasmus had studied, but also Ignatius. So maybe Ignatius and Calvin were there at the same time, I'm not sure. My dates aren't. Is that? Well, he was there 1523 for a few years. Can you imagine a conversation between the two of them? He would have studied Latin, Greek, Aristotle, logic, physics. And it's interesting, he was influenced there by a Scottish philosopher called John Mayer. Now, I can't go into any details about him, but I think that's very interesting that this Scottish theologian influenced Calvin. The conditions in the college were terrible: poor food, cold, and people say that perhaps these poor conditions early on in his life had an effect on his health, because he had very poor health and he suffered a tremendous amount from physical ailments. Meanwhile, back in Noyon, Calvin's father had fallen out with the cathedral authorities. Don't know why, don't know what has happened. He was dismissed from the church, and he quickly advised his son to change career direction and go into law. Now, I think perhaps he would realise that there was more money in being a lawyer than a priest. So, he goes from Paris. He got a licentiate in the arts in Paris when he was still there, but he goes on to study in Orléans, and I think he went there because he was a very, very good teacher there. The Prince of French Lawyers, Pierre de l'Estoile, and he would be the best teacher for Calvin. And when he was there, humanism was a great influence on the students. And when I say humanism, I don't mean humanism as we understand it today, like humanist weddings or funerals. Humanism was a movement dedicated to the rediscovery of classical Greek, Latin culture, and its motto was back to the sources, ad fontes. And I think it felt that there was a lot of kind of sterile thinking in medieval times in Europe. And if they went back to the classical times, they would find the truth. They were more likely to find the true philosophy. And of course, at the same time, the wind of the Renaissance was blowing. But you can see that influence of ad fontes, back to the sources, must have had a great impact on Calvin, and the other reformers, because they wanted to go back to the source of the Christian faith, the scriptures. Back to the freshness, the vitality of the Old and the New Testaments. Now, Calvin probably, as I say, moved around a lot. He's off to Bourges now, just for further study in law. It was a haven for reformist thinking, and of course, Calvin would have been exposed to these new thoughts. In 1531, he graduated in law, and it seems unclear what he really wanted to do at that stage. There was no sense of wanting to be a scholar or a priest, but in a sense too, those years were hidden years. There's not much written about him, except one of his biographers, Beza, who went on to succeed him in the academy in Geneva that he founded. He tells us that Calvin had an extraordinary appetite for knowledge and intellectual energy. He'd often stay up till midnight studying. He wouldn't eat, and then in the morning when he woke up, he'd stay in bed for a few moments, and he'd bring to mind all that he'd learned the night before. He was just a brilliant, brilliant man, and so keen to find the truth of things. Later on in that year, he went back to his village, Noyon, or town rather, to tend to his dying father. And he began working on a commentary on Seneca. And it's very interesting to me that the first article that he ever had published was about clemency, because that perhaps isn't the first thing you think about when you think of Calvin. And Seneca had written this commentary on clemency to give advice to the young Emperor Nero. Nero was wanting advice as to how to rule, whether he should coerce people or he should persuade them. And Seneca wrote this, giving advice about trying to persuade people to go with you as a ruler. And I think that Calvin realised when he was studying this clemency article that Seneca had to accommodate Nero. He almost flattered him in this commentary. And throughout his life, there were aspects of Calvin of his character that tried to persuade people, not to force them into thinking along his lines, thinking the way that he wanted them to think. And it shows Calvin as a man, as I say, concerned with this gentle art of persuading people through the word. And the words were so important to him, making a bridge between the speaker and the hearer, accommodating them. So let's see. After his father's death in 1531, he returned to Paris, and he probably studied Hebrew, and he deepened his knowledge of Greek, and then he was back and forward to Orleans and Paris, back in Paris. The dates around some of these moves are not certain, you just have to kind of guesstimate. So, back in Paris for a wee while, and then a conversion. And unlike Luther speaks a lot about his conversion. Calvin says so little. He writes, God, by a sudden conversion, subdued and brought my mind to a teachable frame, which was more hardened in such matters than might have been expected from one at my early period of life. Having thus received some taste and knowledge of true godliness, I was immediately inflamed by so intense a desire to make progress therein that, although I did not altogether leave off other studies, I yet pursued them with less ardour. So, that's it. He changes tack, and by the winter of 1533, he was known to be a supporter of the Reformation. That conversion experience had just shifted him down the road to the Reformation. And he went to Paris. Don't know quite why he was back in Paris, but he was back. And Nicholas Kopp, he was the incoming rector of the University of Paris. And he gave his inaugural lecture on the need for reform and renewal in the church. And probably Calvin helped him to write that. And the address provoked an uproar. Can you imagine? The University of Paris, the rector stepping in this amazing speech, reform, renew the church. Nobody really wanted to hear that. And King Francis I was very angry, and he instructed people, the reformers, to be chased out of Paris. Cop fled to Basel, and Calvin stayed in Paris. And I love the idea, he assumed a name, Charles d'Esquiville, and he went around pretending he wasn't Calvin any longer. He was this Charles d'Esquiville. And he sheltered with fellow supporters, again this theme of being in exile, moving around, finally decided to flee France altogether. After the affair of the placard, a lot of reformers placed placards attacking the Catholic Mass. They put them all around Paris. They put them, even it said, on the bedroom of the king. And he said, he of course saw this as a personal attack, and so Calvin was chased out of Paris. Now, Calvin left with a friend, Louis de Thiers, for a brief stay in Strasbourg, and then went on to Basel, which was, and that was a very important centre for humanist study and also printing. Remember the influence of the printing press at this time in the history of Europe. It had made such a difference everywhere. And Erasmus had been based in Basel, the famous Erasmus, since 1516. And in fact, he had published the New Testament in its original Greek in Basel. And that is amazing to think that that was the first time that the New Testament was published in its original Greek then. So, the city council had introduced the Reformation in 1529. Lots of people were used to it. Calvin met lots of the reformers who had returned from Germany, full of zeal for the Reformation. And Calvin read Zwingli, one of the great reformers, and studied Hebrew. And he also completed, very importantly, the first edition of the Institutes. Now I've got the Institutes here, 1,000 pages of them. If anyone would like to borrow for some bedside reading, you're very welcome. The first edition wasn't quite as long as that. He published 4 or 5 or 6 editions throughout his life, and the first one was very short. It was dedicated to the king, and it was modelled on Luther's catechisms, and it was a statement of his own personal faith and what the reformers believed. And it was written to help his fellow Frenchmen back in France who were needing spiritual nourishment. And Calvin writes, "My sole purpose was solely to transmit certain rudiments by which those who were touched with any zeal for religion might be shaped to true godliness. And I undertook this labour especially for our French countrymen, very many of whom I came to see who were hungering and thirsting for Christ, very few of whom had been imbued with even a slight knowledge of Christ." So that was his purpose, to encourage his fellow believers. But his life of scholarship in Basel and meeting with other reformers, a peaceful life, was soon to come to an end. A recent church edict had given a 6-month period of 6 baptismal period for heretics like Calvin to be reconciled with the Catholic Church. And Calvin decided that there was no future for him in France. So he left for Strasbourg, which was a safe haven for reformers. But the best laid schemes of mice and men gang after Gray. And Calvin writes at that time that the direct road to Strasbourg had been blocked by warmongers. There was it was such an unsettled period in Europe at that time, we forget that. And the road was closed, so he had to take a detour via Geneva. And he meant to stay there just for one night. He said that Geneva had been under the influence of the excellent reformer Farel, this man Farel, F-A-R-E-L. But the situation in Geneva was still very unsettled, and the city was divided into different factions. And Calvin wasn't at all keen to do anything but pass through Geneva. However, Farel, whom he met there, was full of zeal for the Reformed Church, and he persuaded Calvin to stay and help him in Geneva with the work of reform. He said to Calvin that God would curse the tranquility of his studies if he didn't stay and help him. So, he was a timid man, he said, Calvin said of himself. So he thought, oh well, I better stay and help. So he stayed on with Farel. And the city was divided into factions. Farel was a very fiery character. He'd called for the destruction of images in the churches, statues, stained glass windows. They were removed from the cathedral. I can't imagine, it must have been terrible really for people looking on to see all these things being smashed. I mean, it says here removed, but it would have been awful, I think, for people. The walls of the cathedral were whitewashed. The suppression of the Mass followed. Many of the clergy and religious left the city. And by 1536, a kind of evangelical order had been introduced to Geneva and agreed on by the city council. And throughout this time that I'm speaking about, there was a constant attempt by the city councils, whether it was Basel or Geneva, and the ecclesiastical councils to find the right power base, and they were vying for power much of the time. And even when Calvin and Farel were in Geneva, they were always trying to sort out that balance of power. Calvin and Farel worked on a combined catechism, a confession of faith, together with a church order, and that was all intended to regulate the religious life in Geneva. And these articles of faith, Calvin and Farel thought everyone should take an oath to agree to. It wasn't optional. It wasn't like you'd come to church or come to Mass. They had to take an oath to agree to all these new items of faith. And the catechism was a basis for instructing children. There was a weekly celebration of the Lord's Supper, compulsory attendance, just like in West Kilbride. There was church discipline for those who were in trouble, their marriages, or they'd been found out to be insulting Calvin, for example. It was very, very rigid, and someone compared, one of the writers I was reading compared Calvin to Lenin at this stage. So, the council didn't agree with Farel and Calvin's strictness. They didn't agree that people should take an oath. They didn't agree that those who didn't agree to this should be exiled. And so, there was trouble. There were conflicts and disputes about this power of the church and the council. And that happened, as I say, throughout the time I'm speaking about. However, in 1538, when the elections to the local councils took place, because of these overzealous methods that Calvin and Farel had used, those who were elected to the council were mostly people who opposed Calvin and Farel. They were opposed to them because they thought that they had too much power, and they were worried about not being able to control the Reformation themselves. You know, that the city council was having, they felt that they should be in control of what was happening in the city, and that Calvin and Farel were taking over. So they told Calvin and Farel that they had to follow the principles, the law principles laid out in Bern. Now, Bern, I think, was the kind of leading city roundabout, and what Bern said went. So Bern, the church authorities in Bern, told Calvin and Farel that they had to go along with the rules and regulations that they'd laid out, especially with regard to unleavened bread. As you know, in the Presbyterian Church, we just have ordinary bread, whereas in the Catholic Church you have the special wafers, unleavened. I mean, we have ordinary bread, we've got unleavened bread, is that right? So there was an argument about that, and Farel and Calvin had to go. And they tried to defend themselves to the people of Bern, but they wouldn't have it, and they decided they were persona non grata, and they left Geneva, and before they were flung out, they left very early in the morning, one morning. So, Calvin and Farel went on to Basel, and then they went on to Bern, and then they hoped that they might go on to Zurich, because there was a very famous reformer there. But it didn't work out like that. There was a very famous reformer called Martin Bucer, who was in Strasbourg, and he tried to persuade Calvin to stay and help him there. So that's what happened. He had 3 very successful and peaceful years working in Strasbourg with Bucer. And Bucer was a man with lots of experience. He was an ex-Dominican who married a nun. He'd been excommunicated from the church because of that. He was so keen on the Reformation, and he found himself in Strasbourg, and Calvin worked very happily with him for 3 years. And in a sense, the 3 years in Strasbourg prepared Calvin for his very important stay in Geneva, which is where his most important work was done later on. So Bucer and he had this 3 years of peaceful ministry, and it was the basis for, as I say, for his time in Geneva. Any questions anytime, please ask me. If I'm mind-boggling or bamboozling you, please ask me to explain. So Calvin was pastor of churches in Strasbourg. He developed his pastoral liturgical leadership, and he tried out his discipline when he was there. He drafted orders in French. Remember, everything was in Latin, and it was quite a revolution for the people there to be learning and listening in their own language. So he had French orders of service for communion and baptism. He allowed the singing of metrical psalms. He instigated a public communal confession of sins. He was always interested in that. And he admitted no one to communion unless they had been to this confession time. Nobody could get to communion. He lectured in the academy in Strasbourg on the New Testament, on biblical exegesis. He prepared his commentaries on Romans. He published a much expanded version of the Institutes. And 3 years later, a French version of the same thing appeared. Then, very important, he got married. Some of his friends were very keen that he get married. It would be a help to him. He was hardly a natural romantic. He once wrote, "I know not if I shall ever marry. If I did so, it would be in order to devote more of my time to the Lord." In other words, the wife would do all the non-important things. So he married a widow with 2 children, and he was very happy. He called her the best companion of my life. And it's very touching to read, because sometimes I think it's hard to see Calvin as a man with a heart. In 1542, they had a son who died at just 2 weeks old. Calvin writes that the Lord has certainly inflicted a severe and bitter wound in the death of our baby son, but he is himself a father and knows what is best for his children. So, in Strasbourg, as I say, it was a settled ministry. He met other reformers, but throughout that time he remained in contact with Geneva. And remember, I said that in Geneva, the people who were elected to the council had become his opponents. Well, his supporters were beginning to gain the upper hand in Geneva, in the local government, and they begged him to come back to Geneva because things were in an awful mess there. And Farrell was, Calvin wrote to Farrell and said, "I would prefer 100 other deaths to that cross on which I should have to die 1,000 times by going back to Geneva, because he remembered it with all its conflicts. He was having a nice, peaceful time in Strasbourg, but he went back. Do you think that might be Calvin preaching? So this was really what the time that Calvin's remembered for. He was given a substantial house near the cathedral and a salary of 500 florins, which was double that of the other pastors and more than most of the magistrates in the city. And he was paid by the council, he wasn't paid by the church. It's very interesting, this business of who's got the power. He took up his preaching in the cathedral at the verse that he'd left off 3 years before. In the weeks that followed, he oversaw the drafting of a new church order and new ordinances. He had the idea, which is very biblical, of 4 ranks of ministry: pastors, doctors or teachers, elders, and last but not least, deacons. And they all had their specific roles to carry out in the government of the church. They also reinstated parishes in Geneva, which that had gone by the wayside. They had, I wonder what the church was like. Well, there was weekly preaching, Wednesdays for prayers, Sunday a day of prayer, rest. Attendance at the service was supposed to last for an hour, but probably much longer usually. Men and women sat separately. Psalms were sung. Worshippers stood or sat, didn't kneel. And saints' days and festivals were abolished, unless they fell on a Sunday. And if you didn't behave yourself, you were hauled up before the consistory, which was the court. And for example, one family that hadn't been attending church was instructed to frequent the sermons and the catechism and to buy a Bible and to read it. And then one person was making a noise during a sermon, so he was in trouble. Another one was singing a rude song about Calvin. He was in trouble. For a while, all the inns in Geneva were closed. In their place, 5 abbeys were provided, in which guests were given a French Bible and placed under supervision. There was regulation of your dress, and there was no dancing. But more serious than this were some of the clergy who Calvin considered, and the city council considered, to be heretical. There was a Carmelite priest who was booted out of Geneva for publishing pamphlets criticising Calvin. But most serious was, I don't know whether you've heard of this. No, that's not it. Michael Servetus, who was sentenced to death by burning because he didn't believe in the Trinity. And depending on what book you read, some say that Calvin was really behind this, others say he didn't want Servetus to die, others say that he wanted him to die but by a more humane method like beheading. But again, the context of this time, there was the Inquisition. Perhaps if any of you were watching Wolf Hall recently, you saw what happened to people who didn't agree with the king. And the difficulty about Calvin's thinking was that there was he didn't go along with the divine right of kings. If the king was doing things that were anti-Christian, you didn't have to obey him. So he was quite dangerous in that sense. So Calvin's had a bad press because of these incidents, but he's no worse than many other church leaders. He saw the distinction between the church and the state all along, but it was just trying to work it out in practice, which was very hard. Some of his reforms he met with tremendous opposition because they were too strenuous. Some of his followers thought he was too strenuous. And I think he had quite a hard time in his life. People would come and set dogs on him. They would come to his house at night and bang the doors, and he really suffered a lot because of his views, which I think were pretty extreme. He was a workaholic. I mean, he worked all hours. He wrote letters, he wrote commentaries on all the books of the Bible except Revelation and the Song of Songs. He wrote tracts. He wrote a wonderful, very sarcastic tract against relics and against the pieces of the cross, which he said if they were found and assembled, they would wake up about 10 boats. He found an academy in Geneva at the age of 50, which was a tremendous centre for Reformation teaching. And when there was fighting all around, at this stage, this academy provided reformers with learning, and they were sent out all over Europe. Netherlands, the Dutch Reformed Church, England, the Puritans, John Knox, of course, came to Scotland. People went to Poland and Germany, Hungary, and eventually, of course, the Puritans went over to America. So Calvin's influence through this academy filtered out all over the world. But it's interesting, last month we heard about Luther, and there is a Lutheranism now, but there isn't really a Calvinist church. It's not by name. It's obviously influenced Presbyterianism, but it's not called Calvinism the way that Lutheran churches. When I went to a deacons conference, there were Lutheran deaconesses, but there were no Calvinist deaconesses. For the last 5 years of his life, until his death, he worked through pain, sickness, sometimes so weak that he gave lectures in his bedroom. And when urged to slow down, he said, "What? Would you have the Lord find me idle when he comes?" So despite, or perhaps because of his international renown, Calvin requested that when he did die, he would be buried in an unmarked grave in a public cemetery, his whereabouts unknown except to his Maker and his Redeemer, and that's what happened. There's a huge difference between Catholic theology and Calvin's theology. When I went to New College to study my BD, there was a new professor of systematics there who was an Irishman. He was a married priest, James Mackey, and he said that when you come to New College, you have to get down on your knees and grovel, because the atmosphere in New College was very much influenced by Karl Barth, who was a famous theologian of the last century, and he'd been very influenced by Calvin. And there was this sense of being a terrible sinner. So this is how people have summed up these 1,000 words in the Institutes. Total depravity. We're totally depraved. Unconditional election. That means that those who are elect are unconditionally elected. I'll explain that a little bit. Limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. Now, I don't know what you think of that. Does that fill you with hope?
The only thing I would say, the total depravity, it didn't mean it was entirely, it meant every part was affected. It didn't mean that the person was entirely, but every part was affected.
And it's actually what Augustine, he was terribly influenced by Augustine. It means total depravity. Nobody is capable of saving himself. We require God's grace. Unconditional election. God's choosing of the saved isn't conditioned by anything in them. And that's, I think, what is hard. It's the Holy Willie's prayer. You're either saved or you're not. And that decision has been made by God before the creation of the world. That's what Calvin believed. I think I was listening to a program about Calvin, and there have been many theses written about what exactly that means. I mean, Calvin took this from Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 9, that the elect from the beginning of time, it is there in Paul, in Romans. Limited atonement. Christ's atonement is adequate to save all people, but it's sufficient for God's elect only. Irresistible grace. The sovereignty-given gift of faith cannot be rejected by the elect. Perseverance of the saints, who are regenerated and justified, they will persevere in their faith. So, to me, the great difference between Catholic theology, and I'm talking about 20th century, 21st century, when I was at New College, there was always a sense in Catholic theology, and I had two lecturers who were Catholics, that there was something good in the human which hadn't been erased by the fall, and that through God's grace you could be regenerated. Is that that it's a bit
I think
too...
there's no problem with that. I mean, fundamentally, Catholic theology is fundamentally optimistic, whereas
Exactly. It's pessimism. That pessimism of Augustine seemed to erupt again with Calvin. It's very pessimistic.
Could I ask how on earth he persuaded people that the doctrine of the elect made any sense whatsoever? And it's so idiotic, to be blunt, that it's all decided. No matter what you do, no matter what happens, a decision, whether good or ill you're done, will make, off heaven. And I'm amazed, to be honest, I guess with most of the presentation, that I'm amazed that you reached this position and people didn't say, this guy's nuts. Because it is fundamentally.
Well, one or two of the theologians, the obviously Catholic theologians did think it. And they thought that he'd gone far too far in his theology of predestination or election. I'm mystified as well, and what puzzles me is talking about it with Joe on Friday, that you can't really be certain that you're one of the elect either. And yet Calvin had a great sense of his own calling as a I was going to say a priest, a prophet and a teacher. And I think in this program I was listening to, someone was suggesting that a lot of people who took on this Reformed tradition would check back on their day and see if there was evidence of good works, which is actually the opposite of what really Calvin was, the justification through faith. Check to see if they were doing okay, and perhaps they were saved because a good tree produces good fruit. So, but it's a mystery. I've tried to find an answer to it, but I can't. Maybe if I studied all these doctorates that have been written in Oxford, and someone coined the phrase salvation anxiety. And I do remember when I was a student, I knew a cradle Catholic from Ireland who said, you Protestants, you always got this anxiety about doing the right thing, and we just sit back and relax a bit more. And I don't mean that Catholics sit back and do nothing, but it's a kind of more relaxed about God. And I think that's true.
If you look at Northern Europe and Southern Europe, you see some standards of that.
Yes.
Some are good and some are not good. I remember a few years ago, I think I said, we almost had Greece, Italy, Spain and Portugal in the semi-finals of the Euro. And the very last minute, the Germans beat Greece, so there was another European team. And I thought that would be so wonderful because we were in the middle of the financial crisis, and these four Latin teams, who have the reputation of being lazy and not working, they were enjoying themselves much better than they enjoying themselves better.
The only thing I would say is that with Paul, Calvin agreed that the Spirit that our spirits when we are the children of God. So there would be assurance there, not knowing good works, but of what Christ did on the cross. So, that is the balancing aspect of it.
Yes. I mean, it is easy to caricature Calvin, and there were lots of wonderful kindly phrases in the Institutes that really would cheer your heart. And he talks about people being immersed in Christ. I mean, being a new creation, as it were.
I think the thing is that the third and fourth generation I think third and fourth generation Calvinists drove theology much beyond what Calvin.
I think you're right. I think the isms always, Lutheranism as well, it's not pure Calvin. Yeah, yes.
I think really the fundamental problem, the exact same with the Catholic tradition. There are two truths that are very difficult to reconcile. And one is that tomes have been written about it over the centuries. One is the absolute necessity of grace, it's all grace, and the other is free will. It's very difficult to marry these two things, and nobody has ever entirely succeeded in doing it. And we have different theories about how it works. This is a particularly extreme theory.
He would say that the unregenerate person, the person who's not saved, perhaps haven't come to the gospel, has no free will. Augustine thought that as well. But also, I must say that part of his idea about election and predestination was a genuine concern and puzzlement about the fact that some people seemed to refuse the gospel. And it really puzzled him, why doesn't everybody become a Christian? And he was very taken by that. And he also quotes, I can't find it, from the Old Testament. I mean, there's quite a lot in the Institutes from the Old Testament. He talks about God hating the twins, is it Jacob's two sons, Esau and Isaac. Well, God hated one and loved the other. And that is another example that Calvin took as being an instance of God deciding to hate some and love the other. That's so.
It's a ludicrous.
I've hated.
That was ludicrous.
Well, that is in his But also, what annoys me about it is that it's the Old Testament, and it's, man's interpretation of a story which is good.
There must be people sitting here who perhaps just have come along to find out the Reformation but don't go to church and must be wondering, what a load of rubbish all this is. I mean, there's tremendous truth in that. What are we talking? What are we going on about? I mean, it's terrible, son.
I know it is.
On all sides.
I know. I told you this, I met a very sane minister who was writing a doctorate on Calvin, and she said, do you know, I've fallen in love with him. So I have. And there's a wonderful poem by Edwin Muir, the Scottish Orcadian poet, and he says in it, in Scotland, the Word became flesh and became Word again. I mean, all these words. And we forget that Jesus was a living man of flesh. Living, breathing, not just all these words, the Word. Karl Barth, the great theologian I mentioned, who influenced the thinking at New College, in fact, all his works, he wrote volumes of church dogmatics. They were translated in Edinburgh by one of the professors there, Professor Torrance. who's a legendary figure in Scottish church circles. In fact, one of his sons is Professor Torrance, who was lecturing, I think, at Aberdeen. And so this great figure of Presbyterian thinking was in Edinburgh. And then it was a terrible shock when this Irish Professor Mackey came along and got this Torrance Chair of Systematic Theology. There were letters in the Scotsman about the influence, the terrible influence that this professor might have on the Protestant students. But Karl Barth writes, I could gladly and profitably set myself down and spend the rest of my life just with Calvin. You're missing something, Joey.
What exactly do you expect the rest of his life to never understand?
Say there were so many editions, 4 books, and they were the 4 books are to be studied. I mean, everyone says you really have to understand, in order to understand Calvin, you have to read the Institutes, but it's, well, I don't know. I thought that I would try and read them a little by little, but I haven't managed it. Book first of the knowledge of God the Creator. I'm trying to find it. What did I say? I can't find it here. But in order to write 1,000, I mean, he felt that he was given a gift to write by God, and faith is the principal work of the Holy Spirit, and prayer is the principal exercise of that faith. And a life was to be lived before God as prayer, as a dialogue with a personal God. Can't find it. Anyway. He wasn't the kind of man you could go down to the pub with and have a good time, like Luther was, as someone said. Very serious, very focused, got angry easily if you didn't agree with him. Very strong will, which he inherited from his father. He wrote that he'd written nothing in hatred. I don't know whether people who know more about him than I do would agree with that. If you read some of the biographies of him, he was very sharp about his critics and very quick to take offence. I think also his poor health must have had a tremendous influence on him, and his mood made him very irascible. An introvert, and I think if the Reformation hadn't caught him up, he would have been a lecturer in law at one of the universities. He was a brilliant, brilliant mind. He's always attempted to live faithfully and do what he did for the glory of God. That's what he says. Do you recognize it? He thought that Geneva was the ideal city. He saw real Christianity there. He was so impressed with it. He wrote, John Knox wrote The Monstrous Regiment of Women there. He came back to Scotland and created a stir here. He believed in education. John Knox, very strong on education, the Reformation in Scotland. And there's a great big statue of him as you walk into the courtyard at New College in Edinburgh. The legacy, I don't know, what would you say the legacy of Calvin was? Do you think it's been a good one? He was very keen for everyone to read the Bible. You didn't need a priest to mediate the sacraments, for example. You went to the Lord's Supper yourself. You had a direct relationship with God. Confession was together with other people. There were good things that he said and did, and all the work, the commentaries. I haven't read any of them, I have to confess, but they're supposed to be wonderful commentaries on the Bible that you could read now and get a lot from. He was a towering figure, but whether you feel these are the 4 reformers in Geneva. That's Beza. He took over from Calvin when Calvin died. He took over the academy. He was one of his biographers. Then, what order is it? John Knox? No, Calvin. Sorry, Farrell is first. Guillaume Farrell, with whom Calvin worked in Geneva. Then there's Calvin, John Knox, and it's terrible. Got it here. Farrell, Calvin, Beza, and John Knox. There you go. You can't imagine any of them being young somehow. Someone said that Calvin is a divided self. He had a great confidence in his role, called by God to write, to preach, to teach, but in himself he was not sure of himself at all. Anyway, anything else anyone would like to comment on?
Yeah. Thanks very much. It's a very interesting part of our history, and it's good to hear it explained in that way. I'm not a church person personally.
Perhaps Calvin took you off even more.
No, I was going to say that I didn't expect when I came along tonight that I'd end up trying to support Calvin. But I think the context that we got from the first 2 lectures tells us where Calvin was and what he felt he had to do. There was a very difficult situation, and the corruption and the abuse of the public by the guys who claimed that God was important but had to be channeled through the official clergy. And by the way, we need a bit of financial support, and I don't think we want your uncle to be languishing in purgatory for any longer than we can help. Let's see if we can get something going here. That sort of thing had to be overthrown, and the guys who did it adopted the strategy of going back to fundamentals and looking for a rock the Old Testament. When you take an honest look, I tried to check, I didn't know anything at all about Calvin, but, so before I came out this afternoon, I had a look on Google, and the scriptural support for Calvin's point of view is very strong. It's there in the Bible. So, if you take an honest look at what you've got, and you're going to use that as your rock and your foundation, and that's the conclusion you come to. And you can imagine in those days that you don't know what the end point is until you've done your reading and given it a lot of thought. And it would be presumptuous to say, this is where I want to end up. Let's see what supports that. You do it honestly, and you say, well, we don't know anything about God until we read about it in the Scripture. And when we do, this is what we find. Now, we don't like it now, because we've moved a long way in the last 400 or 500 years. And we realize that we build and construct our religious traditions according to the ideas that are acceptable to the population. In that time, at a later time, in this time. And it's just not acceptable now for anybody to say that 3/4 of humankind are damned and worthless, and the quarter that I happen to belong to, thank goodness, is bound for heaven. And it doesn't matter what we do, it's irresistible, and we're going to get there. And so it's just not acceptable. About the time of the American Revolution, folks said, you know, men are born equal. And that idea has become the popular, the accepted, received idea, and it's not consistent with Calvin's theology. In its time, perfectly reasonable. So thanks very much.
I think that it puzzles me a wee bit that Calvin, well, Augustine did the same. They concentrate a lot on Paul's letters, and I think that Calvin would see Paul as an ideal apostle, and I think Calvin identified with Paul very much. But I feel that Paul was the foundation almost, rather than Jesus. I think if you look at the Gospels, it's a different, to me, a different perspective.
One of the things I want to ask you, you mentioned it, the big idea here. A lot of these groups that are fighting each other were all reform groups.
Yes, they were.
And one of the things that characterised them all was they all thought they were right and everybody else was wrong. And of course that's a very human tendency. And it seems to me that that's the most important thing in all of this is discernment. We have to be able to distinguish what God is saying and what we think God is saying, or we want God to be saying. Be very careful of God to agree with you all the time.
Yes.
You know, because, and that's the really difficult bit, is to understand what's God and what's me. You know, and there are people who think that they thought they have is from God, and it's not true. To understand the movement of God ourselves requires a lot of discernment. And if we fall into that trap of thinking God always agrees with me, which the Reformers, the same as the Catholics, fell into, is a very serious mistake.
I mean, people were fighting battles, and people were being beheaded or burnt at the stake for their beliefs. I mean, it was just, and everybody thought, that their viewpoints were right, and I think there was tremendous turmoil going on at that time.
Calvin was very against Luther, wasn't he?
No, I wouldn't say
There's a lot
no.
of stuff
probably wrote against Luther at one point, but I read it was reluctantly. But
That's another example
I know, but
the confusion that was
I
taken
know.
around.
And people, I think, sometimes were forced into positions that they might not otherwise have been taken because they were fighting each other. I always felt that with Augustine and Pelagius along a few centuries beforehand. Augustine and Pelagius wrote, corresponded, and Pelagius thought that we could save ourselves. We could haul ourselves up by the bootstraps with God's help, but we could do it ourselves, and Augustine didn't agree, and they got more and more polarised. I think that happened. People became more polarised than they might have been, just to prove their point.
Just to remind you what we said earlier on in this programme, that in 1999 the Lutheran Catholic Church was publicly stated that there was no dispute over these issues.
No.
These were issues that were disputed at the time because there was a lot of turmoil and confusion going on. But fundamentally, there was no problem. That's the official position of the Catholic and Lutheran churches. From the Catholic point of view, the real mystery, it's the same for other churches as well, the real mystery is this. Of course, salvation is by grace and faith alone, obviously. But we also have free will. And this is the bit that's so difficult to understand, is that you cannot even exercise your free will without grace. And how that works is a complete mystery to me and to everybody else.
And I mean, it is hard to see there's a place at all for free will in Calvin's schema, I think. Because it's all God. You're justified by faith, but justification, your salvation is imputed to you. You're not really good. It's imputed to you by God.
Anyway, just to end by thanking Muriel very much. Who put up, as always, a tremendous amount of work into it, and we're very grateful to you. So thank you very much.
Thanks for asking me.
Can I make one other comment, which I'll make again when I give my call to the council friend, but just to remind you, this was said at the beginning too. We had some strong words about all these people who were Republican and all the rest of it, but all these reformers were Catholics. The Reformation didn't come from outside the church, it was already happening in the church. Luther was a Catholic priest. You know, so the Reformation didn't come from Mars. There were already strong movements for reform within the church itself. And some historians would say that the person who held up that reform was Luther. And that it took until the Second Vatican Council for the Catholic Church to come to terms with something that would have come to terms much sooner without the Reformation, if you understand what I mean by that. You know, that's just what happened in history. But they came from within the church, the Catholic Church, the pre-Reformation church. And there were lots of reform movements in the pre-Reformation church, as well as all these terrible people in Rome. So it's important to understand that, but we'll look at that later. Next time, our subject is the Scottish Reformation itself, which, as you know, came much later than all this stuff here. And this time, I'm afraid, we don't have a Presbyterian. We go to the other extreme. We have our new bishop, Bill Nolan, who's going to come and speak about the Scottish Reformation. And then after that, we have the Council of Trent, which is the Catholic Church's attempt to respond to the Reformation, which I'll be talking about. And our very last talk is about ecumenism today, because a lot of this stuff that we're looking at is now history. You know, the churches have moved beyond all that. It's important for us to understand it, because if we don't understand it, we don't really understand ourselves. And one of my great hopes about this whole course is that it will help us all to move on you know, because there's a whole load of mythology around this stuff which has hugely influenced the society in the west of Scotland, and I'd like to think that at least in the west of Brighton we can move beyond it.
Can I just say one more thing? Sorry. There was one big difference too between Luther and Calvin in that Luther was keen on reforming the church, which he did, but Calvin wanted to create a city of God. It was the whole of the people of Geneva, which is why there was such trouble with the civic and the... So I meant to say that.